thank you all so much for joining this noon conference on writing an op-ed and subtitled How to Sharpen Your Writing Skills. It's great to be with you today. Just my disclosures, I have no relevant financial relationships, and the opinions expressed don't represent my position at the VA or of the US government. And the other big disclosure I want to make is that I am definitely not a professional writer in any capacity, and I don't even pretend to be. But the purpose of this talk was to share some lessons that I've learned as I've kind of branched out a little bit, writing for the mainstream media, the lay press, and share some tidbits about writing for a wider audience with you all, because I think it is so important as far as a skill to develop. It's so important to get our ideas out there, and so today, in today's talk, I'm going to go over the following aims, and those are to recognize the value of opinion writing, why it matters. We'll talk a little bit about the classic structure of an op-ed. What is an op-ed? How does it look? I want to take you guys through one successful op-ed that I was sort of peripherally involved in, and just deconstruct it and take a look at the format and how the ideas are strung together to make a powerful argument. And then we'll spend a few minutes for those interested talking about kind of the pitch process, how you get your piece out there, how do you actually get it published. And then last, I'm hoping we can have a little bit of a discussion with the group about ideas or how to go about this process, or just generally how to work on your writing skills, which I think is just such an important lifelong skill that at least in my experience, was not really taught. I mean, I wasn't really taught how to write since high school. So I thought that this could be an opportunity to just talk about that, which is, it's just so valuable in academia. Okay. So why op-eds? So why write for newspapers or for the lay press? Well, I think there's a lot of good reasons to be doing this. For one, physician and scientist voices really matter in this day and age. And I think the last 5-10 years have really demonstrated how much misinformation is out there on social media, in the press. And so I think having experts clearly and concisely convey their ideas is so important. And remember that as a writer and as a scientist or doctor, researcher, you know your area probably better than anyone else in the world, and certainly probably better than a journalist who's got an assignment, who has basically like 3 days to read up on it, talk to as many people as they can, and write a reasonably good piece. But it just doesn't compare to the depth with which you bring to that particular topic. So I think it's really a valuable skill for all of those reasons. Another obvious reason is that policy decisions are made based upon largely public opinion, and so when policy decisions are made or under discussion, either good or bad in your opinion, you can help shape what goes into that public policy. And so I think for that reason, it's really valuable. And I can give you some examples of where opinion pieces have gotten the conversation started and gotten people talking about something, and that in turn has led, say, for example, legislators to take up that issue, or even or other researchers to investigate that particular problem. So it's really valuable. Another reason is it's just really fun. It's really fun to share your ideas with so many other people. And while, writing papers in scientific journals is really obviously critically important to getting research out there and sharing that with the medical and scientific community. When you write for the lay press, even if it's a relatively small paper, you're probably going to reach an order of magnitude more people with whatever it is you want to share. And just to give you an example, one of the editors that I've worked with at the New York Times has told me that sort of a bad op-ed generally will get about 30,000 eyeballs, 30,000 readers. A really great op-ed typically gets at least 2 to 3 million unique views. So it just tells you kind of like what the scope is of that of that piece. And obviously, we're not all going to write for the New York Times every time. I mean, that's impossible. They're extremely selective. It's like winning the lottery to get a piece published there. But even at other smaller regional newspapers, or even the Michigan Daily, for example, you're probably going to reach a lot more people than you will with a publication in really any scientific journal. And lastly, I think probably the best reason why I think it's really a great idea to at least think about writing for a non-medical audience is that the way that you organize your ideas and convey ideas in a really concise and clear way for a non-medical audience will ultimately make you a better scientific writer. And many of you are far more prolific scientific writers than I am, and I would imagine could attest to this. But I think that no matter what you're writing, it's really important that you're saying things in a logical way, without all the extra fluff, and you're saying it clearly. And so we'll talk about some of the things that we can do to kind of make our writing even sharper. And I guess that there's one other point that I would make, and that is that these days there's lots of perspective pieces that are published in all kinds of medical journals. And so if you've ever thought about writing a perspective, really it's a very similar format. So to something like an op-ed. So I think that there's actually a lot of overlap there. Okay, so what is an op-ed? Well, an op-ed is a column. It's another name for it, or an op-ed is a column, an essay that traditionally appeared, quote, opposite the editorial page. And that's where the name op-ed actually comes from. And if you open up, for example, I think the one newspaper I can really think of that consistently does this is the Wall Street Journal. If you open up the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which I don't recommend you do, no, I'm just kidding. But if you do, you'll see that on one side, you have the newspaper editors, editorial board writing their commentary. On the opposite side, you have contributors writing. And so that's where that term op-ed comes from. But what is it more practically? Okay, it's basically an opinion essay that has to have usually one, maybe two core arguments that are subjective, that's from your perspective. It's not supposed to be like a definitive, definitive encyclopedic exploration of a topic. It's really a sharp, short piece that kind of conveys your ideas in a very concise and typically conversational style, in a way that people will read quickly and quickly absorb kind of what you're trying to say. The typical length for an op-ed, again, depending where you look, usually is less than 800 words. The Washington Post, for example, they say they want less than 700 words, that's a really hard task to do, is write less than 700 words essay. The New York Times will go up to 800, sometimes 1,000 words, I think, is their upper limit. But generally targeting 800 words is kind of the way to go. So what makes a great op-ed? The most important thing by far and away that I've found is that you have to come up with a key argument. And I know that's like sounds kind of obvious, but you really need to be able to clearly convey kind of what a perspective, a viewpoint, and the way to kind of check yourself, the way that I kind of think about this is I try to basically come up with counter arguments to whatever it is I'm trying to say. If you really can't come up with a counter argument, in other words, if what you're saying is kind of like clear and there's like nobody would argue the opposite, you probably need a better argument. And I'll give you an example with this. So basically, when I wrote a piece last year about wildfires and its effect on lung health, and particularly children's lung health, and why my co-author and I, who's a pediatrician, wanted to write about why that's really bad. And so, it wasn't really enough to just say, yeah, wildfire smoke is bad has a bad effect on kids. That's kind of like clear. I mean, it's obvious. Like, obviously, inhaling smoke is not good enough. So we had to kind of broaden the argument and think about, okay, well, we know it's bad, but like, let's think about like more broadly, what is climate change? Why is climate change really that's driving wildfires? We think, in fact, our argument ended up being that we think that actually this could be the most serious and consequential public health impact on children, in coming decades. And so again, that is our perspective. Many people may disagree and they say, well, no, actually, we don't think it's climate change. We think it's inequality, or we think it's who knows what are insert other public health crisis, opioids. So that was an argument. Again, maybe not the world's greatest argument, but it was something that clearly could be refuted. So that's kind of, again, if there's one thing you take away from this about writing an opinion piece, is that you have to clearly formulate an argument, and in order to formulate an argument, you need to find some counter arguments. Okay, the next point is that when you're writing an op-ed, you need to find an issue that has broad applicability. And that, again, you may think that, for example, writing about a particular rare disease, in this particular subpopulation is like the most important thing to you. But if it's really only applying in that, it very narrowly applies to a very small population, probably like a newspaper is not going to take it up unless it has broader implications. So again, and oftentimes, a rare disease or whatever can really galvanize galvanize sort of attention and support, for that. So you just have to find a way to frame it in a way that's going to really touch or influence a wider audience. The next thing that's, again, really critical, and I'm going to come back to this a couple times probably during this hour, is that it has to be timely. And this is really tricky, and this is really where things kind of I would say diverge in a way from scientific writing, which is obviously very meticulous, requires a lot of time to sort of go through the peer review process, etc. In this case, when you're pitching an idea for an op-ed, you want to have it somehow interact with something that's probably in the news, that's already got readers' attention. So again, back to the wildfire example, literally it was we actually wrote the piece ahead of time, knowing that there would likely be additional major impacts in the lower 48. And so we got the piece ready, we worked with the editor, and the piece wasn't published until we actually had another major wildfire event in that summer of 23. So again, you kind of have to really have your finger on the pulse. And when you think it's a good time to strike, you have to go right away. And I think that's really important. And that's just because these newspapers, which are already struggling in major ways, are just, really trying to get eyeballs to read their pieces. And the only way to get people to actually read it is if it has to do with something that's on their mind. The next thing was just obvious, is that, it has to be written with clarity. And we'll talk about how to do that. There has to be a logical flow of ideas. You can't just kind of throw things together. A has to lead to B has to lead to C, and there has to be a clear structure, which I'm going to go over with you guys in some detail. The next point, again, which I think is probably clear to all of us as doctors or researchers, is that your piece has to be grounded in fact. And basically the way, I would say these pieces, these 800-word pieces, have to be as well researched as any medical or scientific writing that you're doing. Pretty much every sentence that you write has to be grounded either in your own personal experience or in factual material or scientific research that you can reference. And so the way that this is typically done is that you write and you basically put hyperlinks for any assertion that you make. And any good newspaper will basically go through a very intense fact-checking process as you put the piece together. And then the last piece, again, probably I would say the second most important, perhaps the first most important, is that the piece has to be written from a personal angle, from a perspective of, from an angle that shows that you are basically the right messenger to talk about this topic. And again, this gets to basically why you want to write the piece in the first place. It's because you feel so strongly about something that you want to convey to a wider audience. And this becomes obvious when you start to read more of these pieces, like the pieces that are sort of written rehashing other ideas, or those that are based in real deep experience, personal sort of eyewitness accounts of what you think is going on in the world. So I think that's really, really important. So what are some key differences from scientific writing? Obviously, we've talked about the audience. So your audience is not other specialists or researchers, physicians, it's the general public. And so you have to basically assume that the people who are reading your piece know very little about what you're writing. And that's probably one of the more challenging things about writing this as a health professional, I would say. This goes without saying, but pretty much no acronyms. And if you do use any acronyms, you have to explain them. But really, I would say the better pieces don't use any acronyms at all, because you want it to be as approachable as humanly possible. This is where I think, again, this is really the fun part of writing these types of pieces, and that's you want to try to bring the story to life using real life examples or metaphors. Often the parts of the story that really stick with people are the ones that have like a real emotional effect. Obviously, the ones that kind of get your limbic system going. So trying to find creative ways and showing people why this is important, or what this story means, is so important. And again, this is where it's hard to kind of teach this. This is just these ideas will come to you in the shower, or when you're going to sleep, and make sure to write them down, because those are kind of when often the best ideas come around. The thing, again, I think that a lot of physicians and researchers struggle with when writing these types of pieces is that they want to caveat everything. So it's like, well, this is true except when X, Y, and Z is happening, or except in this circumstance. Unfortunately, because we're very, very limited for space, you have to restrain yourself in this front. And this actually gets people, I've reading from what professional editors have written about writing these pieces, and watching panels and stuff about this. I think this is what gets a lot of writers in trouble, and basically they can't let go basically of the piece, because they want to caveat every assertion, and you just can't do that in this kind of format. And then the last piece, which I think is really quite different and very, very anxiety provoking, especially when you do it the first couple times, is that again, the peer review, editorial, and fact checking processes, happen. They're very rigorous. They should be very rigorous, but they basically happen in the order of hours as opposed to sometimes months, right, for scientific papers. So for a piece that, for example, is going to a major newspaper, usually the editor will, tell you whether they like it or not. They'll write back to you. If they want to take it to print, usually by that afternoon or the next day, they're going to send you a heavily edited version, and you basically have to completely rewrite the piece and then go through fact checking, usually within about 48 hours. So it's a lot of late nights, basically. So that is one very different process, a very different aspect of this process, which you just kind of have to like get in the right mindset for. But it's fun, actually. Okay, so you kind of know like what goes into an op-ed, but of course the question is, okay, what should I write about? Well, I can't tell you what to write about really, but I put some little pointers here, and I think these are the things to keep in mind. What keeps you up at night? What are you constantly thinking about? What do you think are the biggest misconceptions in your field of study? What do you wish patients or providers knew that you know and that you've seen with your own eyes, or learned in your own research? How might your discovery, for example, change how we think about the world? And I think this one is probably one of the more straightforward ways, is how does X legislation or policy change affect your patients or your practice? And so this is, again, where timeliness really, really matters. So, and having a finger on the pulse and knowing kind of what's around the corner can be really to your advantage if you want to try to get a piece out at a particular moment. So, for example, you know, if you know that the PACT Act, which was the major piece of legislation, was under consideration in Congress to expand veterans benefits to those with airborne exposures and so forth. If you knew that like this, it's let's say it's churning through Congress, and you kind of know, you've been sort of following the, what's going on in the news, that would be a great time, for example, to like draft a piece and start reaching out to editors and saying, hey, like, I think this might pass. If it's going to pass, I would love to comment on it. I want to write about why this is a monumental shift for veterans, or whatnot, or why this legislation doesn't go far enough. So that's really a kind of a very common theme for these types of pieces. And then the last thing is, again, when suddenly something happens, something dramatic or unexpected in the news happens, you can share sort of what your take is on X current event. And this can be really tricky. This is where, again, planning ahead is really important. But some things, of course, you can anticipate. But I don't know. Let's say some dramatic, new research finding comes out and on your field of study. You get to work and immediately pitch it within hours usually, and then try to come up with a piece. So that can be hard, but kind of being prepared and thinking about it ahead of time is where what can pay off. Okay, any questions about that before I get to structure? Okay, so what goes into an op-ed? So here's kind of the typical structure. And if the more you read these pieces, the more I think you'll recognize exactly the sort of the formula that goes into these types of pieces generally. So usually there's a first kind of introductory hook. And that's usually your first paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs, that kind of paints a picture for the reader and grabs their attention. When we're talking about medicine or health sciences, often this is a patient story. It doesn't have to be, but those usually are the ones I think that are can really be very effective, and especially if you can unblind the patient and get their permission to write about them. I think that's an even better way to do it. Next, you have kind of the key argument, and there's like a terrible name for it. It's called the nut graph, which I don't know where that came from. Graph is just kind of editor parlance for paragraph. But the nut graph is basically your core argument that is most often put at the top of the piece, and usually within usually the second or third paragraph of your essay. This also differs, I think, when you're writing perspective pieces for scientific journals, or you're writing, whatever, doing scientific writing. I think it's common to kind of put your core findings sort of towards the end of the piece in your discussion or something. Has to be with this type of writing, it's very different, because again, you're trying to grab the person's, the audience, your audience's attention right up front, and you know that they're probably not going to read, they may not even read the whole piece. So to try to grab their attention, you have to put that key argument. And this is actually like a requirement at certain newspapers that they follow this format. Next, once you sort of like explain, okay, this is your core argument, this is why you think this issue is so important, then you can kind of step back and get into background and develop your thesis. A common sort of description of this is you kind of do your problem and prescription. What that means is, okay, so this is the problem with the current state of healthcare, and this is what we need to do to make it better. Or climate change, is causing this effect on patients and whatever cities. This is what we need to do to improve it. And that's really, I'd say, the most common format that you see for these pieces. Then towards the end, again, you are allowed and in fact encouraged to present some counter argument or refutation. Now, again, you can't just like caveat everything, but it's good to have something to balance your argument, so that somebody might say, well, this doesn't make any sense. I think it should be this way. Okay, well then you present it and then you refute it. And again, usually short. Usually a couple sentences. That's it. And then finally, you get to your summary paragraph, and here you want to underscore the kind of the core argument. And often you'll leave the reader with a kicker, and they, what that means basically, just something pithy that, sends the message of what you're trying to convey in a very, not facetious, but like, but just impactful way. Here's another way of kind of thinking about newspaper writing in general, and I think this mostly applies to op-eds as well. And notice that on the y-axis you have reader attention. So again, their eyeballs are probably going to read the headline, the heading. They may or may not get to kind of the rest of the piece. So this is why it's so important to put your key findings, your key arguments, right at the top. Heading, lead, nut graph, copy, and the kicker. Okay, so we're going to go through these in a sample essay, which I was very, very privileged to work on and sort of edit by one of my colleagues, Drew Harris, who's head of the Black Lung program in Appalachia and also works at UVA. And so all right, by the way, in case you didn't know this, actually, authors don't write headlines. So headlines for any major newspaper are written entirely by the editorial team. So if you don't like a title, if you think if it's lame, don't blame the author. It was somebody in the editorial board wrote it. So he didn't write this one. But okay, so we're going to go through this one and just kind of look through some of these elements, which I think are really illustrative. So he starts the piece basically describing a patient, and as I said, that's often a really effective way to get your reader's attention. So I'll let you read through this quickly. So, the things that stand out to me, and perhaps, for others it's different, but, the writing is powerful in the sense that it's specific. It paints a picture. You get a sense of a father who's very attached to his son, and there's sort of the intergenerational issues. And you get sort of a flavor for what his life was like. And so I think this is obviously a very, very poignant opening paragraph that obviously I think worked really, really well. Now to write this paragraph, it probably went through 50 drafts. And it's surprisingly hard, maybe perhaps not surprisingly hard to write something so, poignant, pithy, with just the right amount of words. And I think, again, this is really a very effective opening. All right, so after he kind of introduces Denver Hoskins, this patient that he's taking care of, who's now on oxygen and has developed a black lung, he goes through, so using that patient example, he then kind of broadens the scope and explains why this issue basically is so important right now. And this again gets to the timeliness issue. It turns out that the Department of Labor was working on this proposed rule last summer that would essentially reduce the amount of silica dust that was contributing to black lung disease. But Drew's argument was that although he thought that it was good that they're doing this, that the regulations were woefully insufficient and unspecific. And so his core argument here was that, yeah, it's good, but it's not good enough. And it's urgent that they be strengthened before they're finalized. One way to kind of know if you've written a good core argument and you've written a good nut graph is to basically try to summarize your argument in a tweet. And I actually went back in time and I was curious to see because the editor typically will tweet out kind of what the key point in a tweet, and I kind of was curious what she put in her tweet, and here it was. So it's not just coal workers who stand to benefit. Metal, sandstone, and gravel miners are also at risk. All miners need protection. So again, that was what she took away from this piece that she had worked on, and I think it's again a really good it's really good practice to kind of get in the habit of that with whatever you're writing, to make sure that what you're saying is really clear and that can be quickly summarized in literally a sentence or two. Okay, so this was kind of his key argument. Then he kind of steps back. So he talks about how silica dust is found in higher concentration. He kind of explains the problem, right? So this is sort of the getting to the problem prescription part of the piece. Again, giving context, why is silicosis such an issue in these mining conditions? Why has basically silicosis come roaring back and black lung disease come roaring back in Appalachia? And he further develops this, and here's where kind of he gets to the prescription part. He says, you know, like basically, I'll let you read through it, but essentially that the testing requirements are too vague. They need more specific and periodic testing that are enforced. And that basically the rules that they were trying to enforce, which were to require miners to wear respirators, are completely unpractical. And instead, we should be mining and we should be monitoring, ventilating the mines better, capturing and eliminating dust. That's a better way to deal with the problem. So this was kind of, again, these are your kind of key paragraphs where you're developing your idea. Note that the paragraphs are really short in general. A paragraph for a newspaper essay often is 2 sentences, sometimes 3, usually not more than that. Again, so I would say this second paragraph that I'm showing here is probably on the upper limit of how much detail you want to give in a single graph, because again, people are reading these usually pieces really quickly, and so they're trying to get this information across in a really clear and concise manner. Finally, we get to the caveat or concession. Again, this is where you sort of present your counter argument. I have to admit, like in this piece, it was a little bit hard to come up with the best counter argument, at least as was written. I thought this was sort of hinted at a counter argument, which is that basically safety regulations are only useful only if they're followed and enforced, and so this is why we have to sort of change the rules. So it's a little bit of a concession, but I would say perhaps you could definitely find better examples of this type of piece. Oftentimes, yeah, it's sort of your however paragraph that again just sort of gives an opportunity to put some concessions. And then finally, we get to the last paragraph, and here again, I thought this was a really strong. This was really strong writing, where he talks about how, again, we regulators need to be more explicit. He gets the key argument that new rules should include unannounced inspections again, and then he comes back to kind of Denver Hoskins saying how black lung is incurable but totally preventable, and then he leaves with a kicker about the next generation of miners can't be left to drown in dust, and it's actually a link to a song about that. So this is kind of I think a very effective piece. So what did I think? Why did I think this op-ed was successful? Well, one, it actually made it into physical print, which means they got a lot of readers, and so they thought it would it should be printed. That's like a big honor at New York Times, because the vast majority of pieces are just placed online. But going through the criteria that I outlined earlier, I thought this piece had a really strong argument. Again, that these rules are about to be published on mining, and that they need to be strengthened. I think it was very clear what he was arguing. It spoke to an issue with broad applicability. Actually, with this probably, I think, would say it's mostly applicable. Again, they tried to broaden it to speak to other mining conditions. Does it affect most New York Times readers? Probably not, but enough that they thought that this would have an impact, and it clearly did resonate with folks, obviously, as well as folks who concerned about climate change and coal mining and the coal business in general. So I think it fit into that narrative. Was it timely? Yes, because the government was working on these rules, and we're about to there were draft rules that are under discussion. Was it written with clarity? Yes. Obviously, this took a lot of editing over several weeks ahead of time, and then during the actual writing process, there was like furious editing over a couple of days, but they got there. Was there a logical flow of ideas? Yes, and you guys should go back and read the piece, and you'll sort of see that, I think. Was it deeply researched? Yes. You know, everything, basically every assertion was supported. There were hyperlinks to all the factual data, and Drew knows this literature really well. And he also spoke to a number of other experts around the country who helped him kind of craft these arguments. And not only that, but when you're writing for a newspaper, oftentimes they'll assign a fact checker, and in this case, like the fact checker called the patients he referenced and made sure that all the details were correct. So again, they are really careful about messing up any details, because of course, if there's a mistake, like a factual mistake, that immediately just like rips away your credibility. So they're really careful about making sure that while your argument is subjective, that it's based in fact. And lastly, it was personal, because obviously Drew is the head of this black lung clinic. He has a lot of experience. He's taken care of hundreds of patients with black lung disease. And so I think this was probably the best argument for why he was the right person to speak about this. He's a doctor, he knows this disease. He's seen the impacts on patients. He's advocated for them. And so I think these were all the reasons why this piece was so really hit the spot. Okay, any questions about the format or anything like that? Okay, we'll keep going. So I just wanted to share a few other takeaways that I've learned along the way that are applicable to op-ed writing, but also to really, I think, writing in general. And again, many of you are far more prolific and experienced writers than I am, but I think these are some takeaways that I have over the last few years doing these pieces. So the first is like, don't rush. Now, yes, at the very end, there's a mad rush to finish and edit it. But when you're sort of thinking about what you want to write about, there's just no way to kind of rush the process. And oftentimes, as I said, those kind of ideas will come to you in the shower, or, when you least expect them. And so you really have to budget a lot of time to think about how you write, and or think about your ideas, and to pressure test them, talk to colleagues, talk to friends, network, and see sort of what's the state of play on this particular issue. There's kind of no way around that. The more drafts, the better. For most of these pieces, I've like counted, I think usually it will go through somewhere like between, usually honestly, 50 and 60 drafts. So that's really typical, as you're just kind of working through it, bouncing it back and forth, sharing it with friends, trying to like figure out what's the best way to craft a particular sentence. I'm kind of like when I'm working on these, my wife like wants to murder me usually, because I'm like up at night, like looking at Google Docs, walking around, just kind of like trying to figure out like, this wording just doesn't pop. So really just budgeting that time to really work on these methodically, really pays off. The next one, I think, gosh, this is something I learned probably in middle school, but I can't emphasize enough. And, I work with enough medical students and stuff who are writing stuff, and I'm like reading, I'm like, how did you miss this? But you have to read your piece out loud. There's just no way around it, I think. And when you read it out loud, you kind of hear how it, sounds conversationally. And again, that is so important for these particular pieces, because you want to speak with your voice. And for everybody's, that's a little different, of course, but you want it to sound like you talk. And so to me, there's no shortcut. You have to kind of read it out loud, and having a private space to do that is really valuable. Next tip, get a non-medical friend to read it, especially if you're writing obviously about a medical topic. You want to make sure that you share it with a few friends who are hopefully generous with their time and are willing to read it, who don't know anything about the field, because that's really your target audience for these types of pieces. I've already said this, but try to summarize your argument in a tweet, basically in a sentence or two. What are you trying to convey? What do you want people to know about what you're saying? And then put it aside. Write it, work on it a ton, put it aside, let it rest, let it marinate for a few days and then come back to it. It's amazing how much you'll figure out, oh man, that doesn't work. That idea really doesn't work, or this doesn't make sense what I said. So just a generally good tip. And then the last thing, and I credit this to Professor Seglin, who's a communications professor at the Kennedy School. He said basically, when you think you're done, cut 25%. And I think that's a really good tip because it's amazing. You'll notice how many things really are superfluous, how many words are just there that don't need to be there. And obviously that's the job of the editor too to do once it goes through the process. But even before it gets to that stage, undoubtedly there's a lot of things that you can get rid of that probably, aren't adding much to your argument. Okay, so you've thought through something, you're like burning to share something with the wider public, and you've sat down, you've written it, you've shared it with some friends, and you're pretty excited about it. So what do you do with it? Okay, so there's different ways to go about this, and I definitely don't have the right answer. And I've been successful, and I've been unsuccessful probably more times than I've been successful. But here are some tips. I think it's really important to make sure that the publication that you're targeting has sort of the worldview that you want to convey. Like if you're gonna write about how renewable energy is like the best thing in the world, probably the Wall Street Journal editorial page is not the place to do it. Now, all these big newspapers will say, they want a wide variety of ideas, but it's just not likely going to happen because the kind of pieces that they write. So spending a lot of time in researching and then talking to folks and kind of and doing your own reading to figure out what fits with a narrative, what doesn't, is really important. Probably the more effective thing, rather than just sending it generally to an open mailbox, is to actually find the editor who edits that specific topic. For me, what I'm usually writing about is climate and health, so I've sought out the climate editors for specific topics. That doesn't have to be the case. You can send to like the general or deputy editor. But generally it's a good, you have the best shot if you target the person who knows that topic the best. And then I think it's really important to look for co-authors. Now for these types of pieces, usually you can only have really maximum 3, but usually typically maximum 3 authors, but typically more than that is 2 authors, or even better, 1 author. But I think if there's a way to find somebody who has some kind of complementary experience, and as I said for that piece about wildfires and kids, I was like, I can speak about wildfire impacts on lung health, but I can't speak about kids with any authority because I'm not a pediatrician. So that's where I brought in a pediatrician who has expertise in this. So that is, applicable to any piece really, a perspective for a scientific journal or not. Timing, as I've said, is incredibly important. Again, like if you know that gene therapy for sickle cell disease is coming out around the corner, and you're an expert in gene therapy, that's probably the time that you want to be pitching your piece. So how do you actually pitch it to an editor? Well, generally, actually, came as a surprise to me. You don't necessarily want to include your piece. This may be counterintuitive. You actually probably don't want to include the actual draft of what you wrote, because the first thing you want to kind of lure in your editor. And the way you do it, this is kind of the classic way. You write a subject line, pitch a new take on whatever, gene therapy. You write a very, very brief paragraph. Again, they have usually no time to read any of these emails. They get a million of them a day. So very brief paragraph introducing your piece. You want to share why you are qualified more than anyone else to comment on this topic. I'm sorry, but hyperlink all references. That's if you include a piece. If you have anything else to share, you want to hyperlink it. And then you may want to add a time frame. Again, if it's really time sensitive, like if this like gene therapy, whatever is coming out like in a paper in the New England Journal on Wednesday and you want to write about it now, you make sure that they know that, if I don't hear from you by Thursday, whatever, at 12 noon, I will assume that, you're not interested, something like that. And it can be a little bit intimidating to write that, but it's actually accepted in the business. And then, like I said, if you feel bold and you want to just share what you've written, absolutely you can do that, and I've done that in the past. You basically just paste it right into the email. Editors don't want attachments because they're afraid of like viruses and stuff. So don't attach ever anything to your email unless you like really know the editor yourself. So that's kind of the process of pitching your piece. Any questions about that? Okay, so moving along. All right, so let's say you pitch your piece, you found the editor that's interested in is interested and says, yeah, whatever. Dr. Osterholzer, love to take. I'd be interested in hearing a piece. No, they'll usually say no commitments, but I'm interested in a piece on veterans and exposures. Kind of show me what you got. At that point, you can either say, okay, well, would it be possible to set up a meeting to discuss, especially if, there's some lead time, this is not urgent, that's always the better option. If not, then, you can obviously send them your draft at that point. And I think that's usually a very appropriate time to do that. If they agree to it, basically, you kind of have to take a deep breath and celebrate, but then clear your schedule, because usually, as I said, the editing happens within sort of 48, 72 hours. And it is usually, for any major newspaper, it's usually very extensive. It's usually honestly a full rewrite. Uh, you know, so so they will basically go in and suggest moving stuff around. They're going to ask for clarifications. They're going to ask for more sources. Ultimately, of course, you have the final say, but it's a very, very extensive and intensive editing process. And it can be really emotional because, of course, you've worked on this, you know this topic so well. You've written about it. You've worked on it for months, sometimes, or even years, thinking about this topic. And all of a sudden, somebody's telling you, no, you need to do X, Y, and Z. So it can be really hard and really tough. And I think recognizing that, I think in this step, having a friend, a buddy, either a co-author or just a friend to kind of bounce off like your frustrations and like blow off steam is really, really important. Because it's you're sleep deprived and it's really, really hard. So as any writing can be often, and just absolutely infuriating. um, so those are kind of my thoughts about how to pitch a piece and perhaps sharpen your writing a little bit. Here are some of my parting thoughts. I think it's really important to read your target publication, pay close attention to themes, style, top stories, to kind of get a flavor for what that newspaper is going to publish or not publish. Again, couldn't say it enough. Make sure find your argument, and in order to find your argument, make sure you come up with a list of counter arguments. Try to summarize your argument in a tweet, so-called tweet, in a sentence or two. Make sure to read whatever you're writing aloud and give time for yourself to do that, and then have fun. And again, like I said, most of the time when I'm writing something, it doesn't get published or whatnot. But you learn so much along the way, and you hopefully become a better writer as you do this. So those are some of my thoughts, and I wanted to post a few resources to those who might be thinking about writing for the lay press. I thought this tutorial on the Washington Post website is really, really nice. It was done a couple of years ago and covers a lot of the same points that I talked about. There's a couple of YouTube videos too, which I wanted to just share. This was one by Jeff Seglin, again, that professor from the Kennedy School, who I thought really nicely goes over what the elements of an op-ed. And then the last one I thought was really interesting because it's kind of old now. It's 6 or 7 years old, but they did a workshop at Harvard where they actually brought in, I think, the opinion editors from the New York Times, the Boston Globe, WBUR, and just kind of they offered their opinions on what makes a good op-ed for academics specifically. If you have a chance to check that out, I thought it was kind of instructive. Okay, thank you all for joining.